Hello and welcome to Photoshop Basics. In this series is really meant for ITP students with no prior experience with Photoshop, or just not really familiar with Photoshop, but find themselves needing to use it, um, for ITP. I would imagine that you would have to use Photoshop to enhance your documentation photos, maybe to batch process a whole bunch of photos, resize them for upload. Maybe there's like you once in a while, like on a project, you'll come across some graphics that you just need to resize and resave, and you'll be wondering like what's the best format to save it in. So this series should cover enough to help you accomplish basic tasks in Photoshop. Um, Everything that's referenced in this video is going to be stored in my repo. I'll put the link in the video description. Let's talk about why you might want to use Photoshop and when you might not want to use it. So Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. Photoshop, as the name suggests, is a photo editing tool. Illustrator is a lot stronger for, the way Photoshop is built to edit, really looking at the information in terms of pixels and manipulating those pixels. Illustrator's a lot more vector based. It looks at information in terms of vectors. So if you're doing something that's a lot of typography work, and if you're doing logo design, Illustrator would be a lot stronger for that. If you're enhancing images, or just sort of doing a quick and dirty resize, Photoshop might be your tool. InDesign is sort of a layout tool. So say you're dealing, for example, if you're publishing a magazine, so you're dealing with a fairly large body of text, as well as photo images and graphic images, then InDesign helps to bring that all together and lay everything out. So that would be the tool for that. Okay. So it's really important to begin with the end in mind, because you will see that from basically the intended destination of this image that you're using, whether that's for use in a poster or for use on a website, would really affect the workflow from the very beginning to the very end. So I guess the two main categories of destinations would be for web or for print. And the key difference between the two would be the actual pixel dimension of your image. So, for example, something for web, might be say 800 pixels wide, versus something for print. For something to look good in print, you need a lot more information than 800 pixels. Well, I mean, it depends on the size that you're printing it. So we can talk about this in terms of dots per inch or pixels per inch, DPI or PPI. So here's a graphic that explains DPI. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pixels by 5 pixels within a 1-inch square. So this is showing us what 5 DPI or 5 PPI looks like. So generally the standard for print, if you want to get a print that looks good, you would need at least 300 DPI. There are printers that print above this DPI, of course, but 300 DPI is the baseline. I would think of it as the baseline of what you need for a good quality print. So, for example, if you're printing an image that is that is going to be 10 inches wide, then you would know that the pixel width of this photo should be 3,000, at least 3,000 pixels wide. So the standard for digital displays would be 72 dpi or ppi, pixels per inch. So while this is the standard, this is not the pixel density of, say, a retina display. So you would call a retina display a high density, high pixel density display. Of course, it looks so good because it simply has more information per inch. So this means that when we're exporting images for web, we do need to keep in mind exporting for standard digital displays as well as for high pixel density displays if you want your image that is displayed to look crisp on a high pixel density screen. We'll talk more about that later. But right now we can think of print as 300 dpi and web as 72 ppi. So these are probably file formats that we're already familiar with. For web, we're very familiar with JPEG, with PNG, with GIFs. For print, it's better to use TIFF files and PDF files. The reason you would not want to use JPEG for print is because JPEG is the compression on JPEG. JPEG's concern as a format is really to reduce file size. So for print, where file loading times, like the page load time, is not a concern, you want to use file formats that store the information better. So TIFF and PDF would allow you to store your images data without sort of throwing any of it out, whereas JPEG compression, in the interest of getting a smaller final file size, would throw some information out. So just to quickly walk through this, although we probably already know it, JPEG, great for compressing photos and images with complex textures, especially as compared to PNG, which is better for compressing images with large pools of flat color. Say a logo would probably do better with a PNG compression than a JPEG, for example. JPEG has no transparency, no alpha. PNG does support alpha. GIF is unique from the other two because it supports animation. And of course, GIF also supports alpha. So color mode. When we deal with web, we're dealing with RGB, red, green, blue color mode, because that's okay. And for print, we generally would use the CMYK color mode. I'm not going to get too deep into print formats here. This should be good enough for ITP purposes. So we generally associate CMYK with print, and we'll associate RGB with digital. So here is the workflow of basically any Photoshop project. There's the setup, there's the edit, and there's the export. So as you can see, our intentions for how we're going to use the file really affects us right at the very beginning. So at the setup, we want to make sure that we create a file with the correct file dimension. We want to make sure that we get it in the right color space. So we want to use RGB for digital, and we want to make sure that our source images, like for example, if we know that we're going to print a poster and we want an image to be in it, we want to make sure that photo is high res enough. Within the edit part of this workflow, we'll talk more about that later. Here, this is essentially the stuff that happens inside Photoshop and the way you manipulate the image. And then export. So export, we want to make sure that we've got the correct settings for web so that we pick the right file format for the task to get the smallest file size with a decent quality visually. And for print, we want to make sure that we're saving the color information in the best way so that it turns out well for print. So now we've looked at file formats and how different destinations require different file formats, and we've looked at workflow and seen how destination of a file basically affects the workflow from beginning to end. I'm just going to jump ahead a little and talk about what I'm going to cover in section 2 and section 3 in just a little bit more detail. So section 2 is really going to be focused on editing within Photoshop. The key thing here is I want to talk about non-destructive editing. So how to edit using adjustment layers, using smart objects, and using masks. This would give you a kind of workflow that would allow you to adjust your image not linearly, so not just creating, say, a contrast adjustment, brightness adjustment, and a color adjustment, and not being able to go backwards. We want to work in a way where you can adjust all three at the same time and figure out what's the best look for your file. And we want to be able to work in a way where we can basically undo and redo in as many ways as possible. So that's non-destructive editing. Part 3 of this would really be about exporting. So I have created a series of short videos, each with examples to go along with them on how you will use Photoshop to export in these different scenarios. So for exporting for print, exporting for web, for both regular displays and retina displays, exporting animated GIF files, batch processing a bunch of files for resize, and batch processing, say, a bunch of layer comps for export. Layer comps are basically ways that you can set up different layouts or different configurations within the same Photoshop file and export that into a bunch of different files. So that's what we'll be doing in part 3. Okay, that's it for the introduction.